Bismarck in 1917. It was a very, very busy time. And this was the headline after the fact. Substantial progress in all civic and business concerns is manifest. And this will go down as a major period in history. Well, it wasn't quite as, this is kind of hyped, but we'll find out that there was a lot going on in the city at this time. And I love the way they say moral rejuvenation and spiritual quickening. One church. So, but it is a much tamer time than the times that we have talked about when we were the murder capital of the West. And we have progressed from something that was very primitive to actually getting some structure. In 1917, Lynn Fraser was the governor. This was the heyday of the nonpartisan league. And as we talk about the legislature, which was in session in 1917, and also as we progress, we'll see that a lot of the things that happened in 1917 were heavily influenced by the nonpartisan league. A.W. Lucas was they called him the chair of the Bismarck City Commission, but he was actually functioning as the mayor. This again was kind of disappointing as I read, because there were some wild and woolly times in the city of Bismarck's commissions. But Lucas was a good guy who could actually get a handle on things. And we didn't have a sheriff or police chief being shuttled from week 1 to week 2, in, out, fired, rehired, that type of thing that we had seen before. So Lucas had a very good handle. He was a very astute businessman. And this followed through with what he did with this chair. Now, I want you to remember one thing as we're going through here. When you see $1, translate that into $18, because $1 in 1917 would be valued at, if it were 2017, $18. So if you're looking at $1, it's 18. So everybody understands that? Okay. So we're looking at, we've got business lines for the telephone rates at $275 a month to $325, but you can get a 25% discount if you pay before the 20th of the month. So the discount is also if you have a 2-party line. There must be some of you who are old enough to remember the 2-party lines. I grew up out in the country. We were on a 3-party line, and so we knew if it was ours was the long and the short, and the muckles were 2 longs, and you know, so everybody had a ring that they knew, although we had a neighbor who answered it or listened every time that the phone rang, so it didn't really matter for her. It was whether she was going to speak or not. So this also, of course, was the time of the telephone operators, and we had over this time 200 to 400 telephone operators that would, you'd say, give me 211 or give me, you know, whomever, and they would connect you, and of course they listened as well. So it wasn't, you know, we think the internet now is new and novel, that we have all this information going, but it's not. It's just a little bit different. I grew up in a small town. Everybody knew what everybody else was doing. Okay, anybody live on Boulevard by any chance? Do we have a Boulevard person here? This is the assessments for the year. This is Boulevard Avenue, and it would be starting on Block 4, which is by the Capitol, and then heading east. So that corner, remember, you know where that really pretty house is on the corner of 4th and Boulevard there? At that time, their assessment would have been $22.61. And I'm sure they would gladly pay that now. We have gone up a little bit. We live not too far off Boulevard, and we haven't seen 2,000 for quite a while. So I'm sure that they would have been delighted to have this. But these are the assessments so you can get an idea. Taxi cab rates. Now, taxi cabs were the main way to get around in town. Although, of course, there were still horses there for delivery and for riding and for whatever. But the taxi cab rates were set by the city commission so that they didn't have problems with the different companies giving you different information. And so if you wanted to go to the Capitol, then of course you had to pay 50 cents. Well, divide $1 in half, and that's $9 for the ride right there. We're not saying that anything comparatively is cheap. Now, the other interesting thing about this is the police used the taxi cabs to get around too. They did not have cars until the 30s. And so they used the taxi cabs, especially when they had to haul a prisoner in, or if they had to go a distance of any kind, they would have to call the cab. And then when I was going through the police records when I did a history of the Bismarck Police Department, I would see in their day books, taxi cab, 50 cents, taxi cab, went to Bismarck, $2, taxi cab, so they would take taxi cabs for the important stuff. Otherwise, everybody was on foot. Now, another part of this is they specifically had to the Capitol, to the penitentiary, to the Indian school, and then to the river, and then across the river. And we have to remember, this is a bridgeless time. The only bridge that was going across the Missouri River at this time was the railroad. The City Commission had tried to make an agreement with the Northern Pacific that they would allow cars to go back and forth between Mandan and Bismarck 4 times a day. But they could not work this out. They would have had to go on the ties because they would refuse to put anything on there that would be smooth. But it would be a way that they could get across. Other than that, in the summertime you used the ferry or you went by train, and in the wintertime you drove on ice. So, if you're going to Mandan on ice, it was $4. And if you went on the ferry, it was $5. So, actually, I think I would have preferred the ferry because the way the ice moves on the Missouri, you might get a very, very cold bath before you got there. This is the legislative session of 1917, and as I said, this was the heyday of the Nonpartisan League. So many of the things that came out of the legislature were functions of the Nonpartisan League that they were specifically trying to get into place. For example, in 1917, our state budget was a little under $4 million. Do you know what it is now? It's $3.2 billion for the next biennium per year. So the next biennium is over $6 billion. So looking at this, they thought it was pretty high, is what they were trying to get it down, because they had initially started out with 500,000, got it down to this number, and were kind of satisfied. But you know, they probably would have had heart attacks if they would see what it is now. Fire truck. They needed a new fire truck. The fire truck was shot, and they had to have a fire truck costing $5,000. You know, this was just absolutely something that the city commission didn't know how they could possibly do. They're going to have to ask for a bond, see if they could get enough money to get this together. I called the fire department and I said, what is a standard stripped down version that you get of a fire a truck that you see going around? And they said, well, it starts about $700,000. So it's a little bit different now than then. The salaries, these are the city salaries. And again, you have to remember, multiply by 18. So some of these are part-time, and some of them are full-time. Although on the left-hand side where you see like the overseer of the poor, the health officer, milk inspector, those are full-time positions, but they were not considered professionals. And so they were living on $50 a month. And then you have custodian of the fire hall. I'd love to find out why he was making $100 a month. You know, there has to be a story behind that. When you look at the milk inspector and the chief getting, you know, $75, but I don't know. City commissioners, $40 a month, and of course that was in meetings and in duty, so that was not full-time job. The treasurer, again, only $25. So, and I do not know what the weight master really did. But the chief of police, 135, and opposed to chief of the fire department, 75. It's just really strange how these are all set. But if you're multiplying as you go along, you can see that probably, because these were considered good salaries, the average person was living on about $40 a month. Is what you're looking at. Wild Bill Langer. Wild Bill Langer was Attorney General at that time, and the legislature decided that they wanted to clamp down on Bismarck. Now, Fargo was a piece of cake. Fargo conformed, they did everything they were supposed to, they were really good people, but then you had Bismarck and the western part of the state, because they were just as bad as Bismarck. We had pool halls, we had blind pigs all over the place, we had houses of ill repute. It was awful. And we actually had stores that were open on Sunday, even if they weren't supposed to. And so Langer said he would do what the legislature wanted, and he was going to force Bismarck to become a reputable town. So this is an older picture of Langer. There was a younger picture, but we could, where's Ann? Ann is my savior. She's the one that puts these PowerPoints together for me. And she tried to clean it up enough from the newspapers, but we just couldn't do it. So this is when he was governor rather than at this time. He wasn't that old. But you can see that it was just a totally lawless town. And so Langer says, okay, we're going to clean it up. Well, first of all, the blue law. The blue law had been on the books since 1889 when we became a state. And if Fargo could be totally shut on Sunday, then Bismarck certainly should be shut as well. There was a judge by the name of Robinson, of the Supreme Court judge. He had scathing things to say about Langer because he could not get a cigar, nor could he get his newspaper because Bill Langer had shut down the stores in Bismarck. And he was just irate. He wrote column after column about this horrible man that wouldn't allow him to read his Sunday newspaper until Monday. Then we had raids going on. Almost every newspaper for February, March, April, all of them talked about shutting down the houses of ill repute. And there was an order to close them all. And so time after time, and interestingly enough, the same names kept popping up, that they were shutting these places down. They'd bring them in, they'd pay a fine, and lo and behold, they'd be back, in 2 weeks or a month or whatever. And interestingly enough, in the 1920 census, I had found that there was a black population in Bismarck, about 200 people at that time. And 2 of the women on the south side who were declared as Negro actually listed their profession as being a prostitute. And so when I was reading through this, guess who popped up in the going to court and getting fines? The same 2 ladies that I had seen previously. An address that popped up all the time was 1010 Front Street. Yeah, everybody's smiling because they know what 10, yeah. So 1010 Front Street, it was all over the place. So the houses were closed down, fines, pay them back to work. It really took a lot of time and effort, and at the end it really didn't do much good. Now, I learned a new word. I had heard the word blind pig, but I had never heard blind piggery before. And this was quite frequently in the heading, blind piggery going on in Bismarck. And of course, this is something, again, that was unbelievable, that why can't you have booze? Well, just because we came in 1889 dry, and this is 1917, you would think by that time that people would have gotten the message. We did not have a legal saloon in North Dakota. But yet, we had all of this drinking going on. And so we had this going on all over town. Again, Langer says, shut it down. And here we go with fines again. And we're not just talking, $10, $15. We're talking $200, $250, $300 for these fines. But back in business. This is something that is just fun. Most of the time we don't have a whole big time with, yes?
What was the Raymond and Carter?
Those were the names of 2 of the gentlemen with the house of ill repute. Yeah. Not too often do you see something that is amusing in court, but I saw this headline, and I'll read you what was said in the court. Chief Martinson, we've talked about him before, but Big Chief Martinson, yesterday picked up Angelo Cicero, who was on his way but uncertain as to his destination. This morning, Angelo was arraigned before Justice Blackride. He was very much frightened, and his nervousness added to a natural impediment of speech. "What's your name?" demanded the magistrate in his deepest basso profundo. Sizzled Cicero, and then stopped. Again, Judge Blackride demanded his name with the same result. Finally, he turned to Chief Martinson. "What's this man charged with?" "Well, Judge," Big Chris came back, "it sounds to me like he's charged with soda water." Soda water, yeah. Yeah. We had a lot of growth in 1917, and we'll go through, maybe you'll recognize a few of these as we're going through. Maybe the buildings may still be standing where they were at that time, and maybe even have the same uses. For example, the first one is Corwin Churchill Motors. And this was the third time in 3 years that they were having to expand because business was so good. They sold Buick and Stearns cars. Now, I've never heard of Stearns cars before. And Stearns Knight. Stearns-Knight is the name of it. And this is on Main Street, and everybody knows where Corwin Churchill, well, this is the start of it. The Fair Store. Do you remember the Boutresses? Well, this is the department store that they started in 1917. They had women's finery, they had stationery, and it said a lot of groceries. And so the Fair Store, and it was located at 210 Main. Then we have the Haggart Block Edition, and this was built by E.A. Hughes, and that's a very familiar name for most of us. And he had a building that housed 20 offices that was designed by Arthur Van Horn, one of the very first architects in Bismarck. And it was at 3rd and Broadway. Then we had a plant moving in. And this is the North Dakota Pressed Brick Company. It was in Dickinson, and they were making an addition in Bismarck. And pressed bricks, of course, are the ones like cement blocks that we have now, so they're not a solid block. And this was supposed to be the next great innovation for buildings. Then we had the first Guaranty Bank, and this was on the Herdsley property on 4th Street. And it was a building that cost $40,000 to make. The Capital Security Bank, Senator C.W. McCready, who was from the Washburn area, started this bank, and it was at 5th and Broadway, and this cost $50,000 to make. So we're getting bigger and better as we go along. The hollow tile plant that we had on the previous slide, the $100,000 plant, on February 27th, has now become the $150,000 plant because they had to have kilns for the firing. And so the actual building itself was $100,000, and then this was $150,000. E.A. Hughes purchased the Bismarck Tribune for basically what they owed, which was $13,600. It had been in bankruptcy and investiture for a little over a year by the time he took it over. The Bismarck Public Library was announced on March 13th of 1917, and it would be a wonderful library. It was a Carnegie grant and would total $25,000 to build. And we have all seen the handsome building that was built, and it's just unbelievable that it only cost $25,000. The new modern plant of the Missouri Valley Motor Company, and this costs $75,000. Carl Pedersen was the name of the manager-owner. They sold Dodge and Chalmers cars. Chalmers, Chalmers, and this was on East Main Street. Then we have the Bismarck Public Library, and the plans are approved on April 2nd for the building. Then we had approximately 50 lots that were sold by the F.E. Hedden Land and Insurance Company. And this was in the Flannery and Weatherby edition, which is over in the Washington area, and it would be A, B, C, that section in there, which we now describe as the Cathedral District. And in a little over 2 weeks, they sold off all of these lots. And so when you look at the houses over there, they're all approximately from this same time frame. In April, the Logan's on 3rd came to be. And this was the grocery store. Anne's relatives are the Logans, and so she always likes to talk about the Logan grocery. But unfortunately, when they built the Logan's on 3rd, they took one of the oldest buildings in Bismarck down. It was the Slattery building. It had been erected in 1878, so it was one of the oldest buildings still standing in Bismarck. However, they had been so much of a hurry to get in business, they had erected it in 3 days. And so it was not in terribly good shape. There didn't really have anything that would be of great value, so they tore it down and did put a brick edifice in place. The Hinckley property sold as well. Now, if you know where the former governor's mansion is, on Avenue B and 4th, this is directly south of that. It was called the Hinckley property. At that time, there were 4 houses that were standing where that one house stands today. Can you visualize it? That nice, it's a beautiful building. But 4 houses were on that property where that one house is. And it's 150 foot square property. This was really interesting when I found this. When they started digging for the library, one of the first scoops that they took out, they hit a skeleton. And that skeleton, of course, was a mystery that to this day is not solved. They don't know who it was. They figured it had been there for about 20 years at the time that it was dug up. It was a male, but they don't know who it was, where it came from. There was no house that had been on the property, so it remains a mystery who this person was. In June, the new nurses' home came into being. This was for the Evangelical Hospital. Are you trying to tell me something, Walt? Okay. The nurses' home for the Evangelical Hospital was built. So the nurses who worked at the hospital, and they had to be single, had to live at the nurses' home. The Bismarck Country Club opened in July. Huge do as they opened up. About 500 people attended. This was put together by the members of the club, and it became a hot spot, particularly when World War I was going on, for all of the things that were going on to help the boys before they went overseas. J.B. Halloran took over the insurance company of P.E. Byrne, B-Y-R-N-E, and it became the J.B. Halloran and Company Insurance Company. Yes. Where it is now. Yeah. Yep, still the same. Then in August 20th, big blaring headline said, "Business as usual practiced in Dakota building operations." And they had a big write-up of all the things that we've been talking about, plus the fact that they stated in there that for this year, they had spent almost $500,000 on getting the sewer into the city of Bismarck, and they also had paved the streets. So this was the first time that there were paved streets in Bismarck. And it made a world of difference with people, except we had a problem with 4th Street. We had a cable car that went from downtown to the Capitol. Well, guess who owned the cable car? The state owned the cable car. And so the city owned the street, the state owned the cable car, and so the city was saying, it's your car, we shouldn't have to pay to have it paved. And the city was saying, and the state says, well, you benefit from having that car there because you can rent rooms to the people who work at the Capitol. They can get up to the Capitol to work, no problems. It costs 10 cents for them to ride, so it isn't too expensive. They don't have to take a taxi. This squabble went on all year. And it was only resolved finally in October when the state agreed to pave the area in the middle of the street where the cable car was, and then there would be a curb put where beside the tracks, and then the city would pave the rest of the street. So they finally did come to a compromise, but it was an amazing amount of trouble before it all got done. And so there was also a question of maybe the city should buy the cable car from the state, and then off we go again. So it was back and forth. Somebody should do something, but nobody wanted to do anything. The usual.
When did the cable car disappear?
Well, at that time, they were talking about the fact that maybe it should disappear. But it actually ran up through the 40s before it was taken off. Mm-hmm. Richelt, he decided that he was going to have to expand, so he built a 60 by 25 building that was a storehouse on the main floor and then an apartment on the top. So his family lived above that. And this was on 7th and Thayer is where this was. So all of these things were being erected in the city at the same time all of this paving is going on. I read an article, it was society pages and, personal notes and this stuff. A guy lived in Minokan, and he had driven into town, and he said, this is the finest road that it could possibly be. It had only taken him 40 minutes to get from Minokan to Bismarck. So, a little bit different driving than what we do now. I thought you'd be interested in what kind of weather we had at this time. I think that in '97 we might have rivaled them for the 5-foot figure for snowfall at one time or another. The hottest day, this was the hottest day that, over 100 that they had had in several years. And then the mercury, we see that, but they had 39 degrees in 36 hours, a drop. It was a time when it was very cold. Then we had a hot summer. So it was, it was North Dakota, I guess you could say. That's probably the best description for it. And they had a new car ferry. So, for the first time, they had 24-hour ferry services. It was called the Marion, and I saw it spelled two ways. It's with an A and with an O, so I don't know what it was. But, in fact, almost side by side. But the Marion was a gasoline-powered ferry that could take 8 cars, and it ran 24 hours a day. So we finally had reliable service going across the river that had never been before. And of course, everyone was extremely pleased. And the other thing that was happening simultaneously was they were actually putting a road to the river. So you could drive down to the river, which you had never been able to do before. So the two things made it much easier, much faster to go on what we call the Old Red Trail, which turned into Highway 10. Benny Hannafin was getting very old. He had been here since 1872, well, off and on, because he did go to Alaska and make some money and lose it, and a few things like that between. But he was getting very old, and they decided that they were going to have a benefit ball for him because, as I said, he had gained fortunes, but he had also lost them. And so in February, they had a benefit ball. He was always called the squatter governor because he never held office, but he was such an integral part of all the politics and knew all of the players in the politics in North Dakota, that he titular, yes, but this really was what part he had played. And then we have World War I coming along. And this was a time when we had troops that had already fought in the war because they had gone up to Canada and enlisted. In fact, I was surprised at the numbers that we had that had gone up and fought for Canada. But we also had men who were down on the north border fighting against Pancho Villa. And Villa was trying to make inroads into Texas and along the border. So Company A from Bismarck had been sent down to Texas and had been down there trying to stave off Villa for a considerable amount of time. When they get home, almost a week after they got back, war was declared. And so it was not a homecoming, very short-lived, and they were ready. That's the only ones that were ready to go for battle. And of course, they went almost directly off again to Fort Dodge. Patriotism, well, first of all, North Dakota was not happy we were in the war, because whether Walt wants to admit it or not, Bismarck is 52% German. It was then actually 50%. It's 56 at that time, 52% now. And so there were a lot of people who were here at that time, who had come to Homestead and were born in Germany. And so there was a lot of, do we go and fight against our brothers or our cousins or whatever, or do we stay out of it, or what do we do? And lots of hassle. In fact, North Dakota is the only state in the Union that voted against both World War I and World War II. And a lot of that was the same thing that we're talking about, is the ties that they had. And so it was very strong. We had people who were put in prison for sedition. We had letters to the editors about if anybody was to go over there, they should be hanged. I mean, it was terrible. There was very patriotic, and then there was very, it was a really tough time trying to decide whether you were still German or whether you were American. Well, what happened was the usual thing that happens in North Dakota. We fight about it, we argue about it, and then we get ready and we settle in and we go gung-ho. And that's exactly what happened with World War I. The people who were born in Germany that did enlist, many of them actually were not sent to Germany. They stayed here and guarded things that they thought were important, but they did enlist in the Army. The Red Cross, we had women, picture after picture of women knitting. They were knitting everything that they could possibly knit that the soldiers could use. They were selling bonds. They were selling seals. So they had quotas that they were to meet. Most of the quotas were doubled when the final questions came down. The 5th, June 5th, was the first draft. And of course, there was a lot of controversy over this as well. The draft registrants were taken from all over in Burleigh County. And they figured 2 for 1. They figured they needed 2 to draft to get 1 to go. So they were anticipating that only half of them would meet their physical and mental requirements. Page after page in the newspapers of the guys that were drafted. And also the ones that of course, went readily. Red Cross drives all over the place. $10,000. Just think about that. How much? That would be $180,000 is what you're looking at right now, that they raised in 2 days. So once the patriotism kicked in and people decided they were going to do this, it went very quickly. They found out that the Army was bringing in the people to, the Army was bringing boys to the armory and keeping them there before they put them on the train to go to Minneapolis for their physicals. And they didn't have a thing in there. It was completely bare. So practically overnight, again, the women, cots, blankets, you name it, sheets, pillows, the whole bit. And when the guys got here, it was fully arrayed. Everything was there that they needed to be very comfortable, and they fed them. Not the Army, but the women of Bismarck fed the guys while they were waiting to get on the train. They also helped serve the soldiers. They had a kitchen that they established in the depot in one area that was strictly for soldiers. And so when a train was coming in with troops, that kitchen was opened, and they would serve every trooper that got off the train before they went on. And then, of course, the seal, almost $540. This is a picture of Company A. It was horrible in the newspaper. Anne did a great job of cleaning it up, but if you're going to find your relative in there, I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. But this is Company A, and they had just returned, as I said, from Texas, and then immediately shipped out for the war. These are the churches that were in Bismarck at the time. The only one that Anne didn't find a picture for was the evangelical church. Otherwise, these are the churches that were in Bismarck, and you probably recognize some of them. Some of them no longer exist. And they were very active in the community, especially with the war effort, the women's associations, women's committees. And then we also had a church that started that year, and this is the church. It was at 8th Street. Can you see the number? 310, 8th Street. And this was started by the black population. And this is the amounts of money, although there were more than this, that were given to start a church. How many of you have heard of Babe North? Ever hear that name? He was an extremely popular heavyweight boxer. In fact, he was a champion. And he was fighting for the title, and he was fighting a guy from Jamestown who had had the championship for quite some time. And so they decided what they were going to do with that match, because Babe was so good and also the guy from Jamestown. They each took on 2 competitors before they fought against one another. Babe won. So he got the championship. Boxing was a huge sport at that time. In fact, Patterson was he was a middleweight, and he never turned professional, but he had his own boxing ring in the basement of the Patterson Hotel. A lot of guys trained there, and there were also a lot of fights there, too. So boxing was big. Now, the next one, this is again the language. I looked at this and I had to laugh, Because if we put this in about the Dodgers now, that probably would not go over too well. But at that time, it was a different use of a word. So, what they meant was strange. Dodgers will present a strange front in 1917, and what they're talking about is the fact that a lot of their superstars were being drafted or enlisting in the Army, and so they were going to have a real mishmash of people who had been there for a considerable long time, but a lot of rookies. So language changes. I would like to read this to you because this is something, once again, that is very interesting. Baseball was definitely king in the summertime in Bismarck. And it just so happened that the Bismarck team had been champions for several years, and this year they were not doing so well. And so they talked about huge crowds and tremendous turnouts, all of these things. But people are starting to go away because they weren't winning. And so the 33rd degree fan, whoever that may be, put this in the newspaper. To the lovers of baseball in Bismarck and all others with red blood in their veins instead of ice water, Bismarck is the best town in North Dakota, the cleanest, most liberal, and most patriotic. Also the best show town. Bismarck is a live baseball town too. When the fans come out of their Rip Van Winkle, let's quit talking about what a good team we had 10 years ago or last year. But get behind this year's team with our quarters and half dollars instead of standing on the street corner with our hands in our pockets, kicking because there is nothing to do but go out to the ball game where there is a game on and root for the home team when it's losing and holler our heads off when it's winning. They played the next day and they won, and they went on to take the championship for the year. So he probably did some good for them. This is July 21st. Halliday came here. They had 800 people show up for the ball game. And they had been beaten by Bismarck 2 weeks before this. So they were coming to Bismarck to play. They got beat again. So Bismarck won. And golf was big. We had the country club. We had the golfers. And in August, they went to the state tournament in Dickinson and did not do so well. So obviously they hadn't been golfing for a considerable long time. Dickinson golfers beat the pants off of them. This was very interesting. This is the first girls' basketball game in Bismarck that was played against another town. So they had different ball teams. Well, I suppose you'd call them intramural. That's what you would call them. But this is the first time in Bismarck where there would be a girls' basketball team playing against another girls' basketball team. Bismarck against Mandan. And Mrs. Densford was the coach. It cost you 10 cents to get in, except if you were a mother of one of the girls. So then you got in free. So they had this, and you know what? I looked for who won, what the score was. In fact, I looked, concentrated for a week after the game to see if they would tell me who won. Not a word. Don't know. Have no clue who won the game because it was not put into the Bismarck Tribune. So I don't know. But I might speculate that perhaps Mandan won because of that. But I thought it was interesting. Maybe you have some relatives that were on that team. The forwards were Rose Hanlon and Margaret Bishop. The center was Lorene Thomas. And Bertha Rigler, and the guards, Gladys Carley, Mary Slattery, and Ethel McKee. Anybody know relatives? No. Okay. So first girls basketball. Back to school. At this time, there were 1,500 students in the Bismarck school system. It had risen quite dramatically in a very short time. At this time, there were 8,000 people who were living in the city limits of Bismarck, and in Burleigh County, there were 15,000 people. Now we're going to go into lifestyles, and that's kind of fun. This is, of course, something that, well, you know, everybody thought they invented near beer not too long ago. But this is exactly what you have. You have the new style non-alcoholic beverage that was not only tasty, but it was extremely good for you because it had all kinds of medicinal you know, it's just absolutely fabulous. And so, gee, I mean, if you didn't, if you couldn't get alcohol, this was next thing. The theater was huge. There were 3 theaters that were constantly playing different types of things. There were troops that were coming through that were musicals, dramas, all kinds of huge productions that were going on. This was the way that people celebrated by going to the shows. It was all of 10 cents if you were a child under 12 and 15 cents for adults. Now, where's Mike? Look at what these naughty elks were doing in 1917. They had the minstrel show, which was a rousing success that sold out. This was probably the best. They had several ads, and some of them were worse than this. So I decided to use this one. But they sold out, and then they had all kinds of parties afterwards, and they had a great time. And the prices, you know, it was pretty pricey to get in there, but it obviously was worth it. And they had 3 different levels of tickets as well. Had a huge parade so that this all went on to celebrate this. These are things that I don't know why we need doctors anymore, because they had the cure-alls for absolutely everything. This is if you had skin that you weren't satisfied with, all you had to do was go to the drugstore, and they had this wonderful concoction that they could make for you that involved lemons. And then it would whiten your skin, and it would take all of the blemishes away that you ever had. Now, a diamond. $1 down, and then $1 a week after that for 10 weeks. And you could have your diamond. Not bad, huh? This is the latest undergarment. This is the absolute best that has come from Paris. You know, if we had to wear this, I think that all of us in here would probably protest vehemently, but this was something that you had to have. Bathing suit, you know, when we were looking at this, I said to Ann, I said, how could you swim in that? You'd drown. With that much cloth. And then, of course, the shoes from A.W. Lucas Company, they were the absolute total fashion trend. And you can see that some of them actually were a shoe with the high top. January white sale, and then we had furs. Furs ranged between $100 to $200 is what I saw. So we have a 25% discount. The white sales, you can see over to the right side some examples of what you can see there. Hats up to $7.50 value, now 98 cents. I mean, wow, what a discount. And black hosiery, you know, which was a real luxury, 19 cents. So these were extremely sellable. These are examples of fashions of the time. As you can see, if you showed your ankles, you had to have a boot on, because a lady did not present her ankles in public. Also, the hats were de rigueur up and through the 40s and 50s. For the most part, women did not go out of the house to anything that was public without a hat on their head. And so that was very important as well. I love the headline, early crop of spring hats. I don't know whether they couldn't find male models or men who would show you what they looked like. I could not find one ad for men's fashions that were actually showed them on a male. So they were just plain. Gordon's hats for $3.50. These were the best hats. And you could get a suit, regular $50 suit on sale for $37.50. You know, all kinds of, so the best suits for $50, and then we go down to $15 for suits and overcoats. This is funny as well. You know, you still have the expression, like Ann said, she didn't even know it was an actual product. And we still have this expression in sometimes the body side, sometimes the clean side. But Shinola is still, you know, part of our vocabulary. And of course, what it was shoe polish. So you know, you just kind of wonder where these things come from, and that's exactly what it was. And then you can see the male more than, this was the only way I could give you a male model, because this was the only one I could find. You can see the suit of the day. These are the tires. And depending on what size you wanted, it ranged starting at about $9 and went up to 27. But look at how thin they are in comparison to what we have today. And they were also taller. And this is a truck that you could get for $350. And it's a 1.5 ton, and it's very reliable, and it can carry a 50% overload. So you could not go wrong with the Ford Dearborn. Here you have one of the top of the line Willys cars, absolutely the Willys 6, and you could get it for $1,325. Most of the cars averaged about $700 to $800 is what you were looking at. This is what you would heat your house with. Coal was king. They would bring it in by the trainload from the east until the war, and then they had to go with the lignite coal that we have here. So we started mining more of our coal because they wouldn't give it to us. They said the eastern part of the state and the troops needed it. Eastern part of the country, excuse me. This is your kitchen range. And so you had, it was quite fancy when you look at it, but you do have your stove top and your oven up on top, of course, because where your coal went was down below. Grocery ads. This is Logan's. This is the one that's Logan's on 3rd, phone 211. And you can see that they had some very good specials for the time. And there's also a picture of the interior of the Logan's and the exterior. Another grocery ad from Gusner's Grocery. And you could get apples for $1.25 a box. Now it's about $1.25 an apple, if you're lucky. Toothpaste. Finally, after years and years of testing toothpaste, they determined that the purpose of toothpaste was to clean your teeth. Didn't have any other magical properties, no nothing like that. It was simply to clean your teeth. Now this is a miracle worker that we need right now, because Dr. Mellenthin was a specialist who could operate without opening you up and cure appendicitis, gallstones, ulcers, tonsils, adenoids. So no surgery involved, and you could get rid of them. I mean, I don't know why we still have problems, medical problems. Asthma suffers the same thing. If you have chronic asthma, there's no reason why that you have to have it, because all you have to do is go to the drugstore and pick up the miracle cure, I guess you would call it, and you're in business. Houses for sale. I thought you might get a kick out of this. You can get an 8-bedroom house that is obviously extremely well kept and has oak finish at $3,700. And a 6-bedroom house that you can get for $2,250. I would love to know which houses they are so we could see how much they cost today, but I don't know what they were. And then got a 7-room bungalow, modern, for $4,300. So then we have rooming house furniture and Goodwill with an income of $30 a month, or $90 a month, and it's priced for only $750. Amazing. This is the menu for the Grand Pacific Hotel for Christmas Day. And the whole thing costs 75 cents. And some of that, I don't even know what it is. But You can have your choice of all of that for 75 cents. Then we had a really interesting mystery pop up. Found this, and it says that a woman from Bismarck, Edith Hughes, had written a book. And it was about her travels with her husband to the east and then back again. We actually found that you can get a copy of this book, which is a rare book, for $150 if you would so desire. This is the description of it. It's motoring in white from Dakota to Cape Cod, leisurely taken via Montreal, including the Adirondacks, White Mountains, and Berkshire Hills, with every night on water or overlooking water, stopping 1 week in New York City and back in Bismarck within 6 weeks. So this was a very well touted book, well written, and she wrote it. And also in here, it also says that Hughes had the first automobile in North Dakota. And we were wondering whether Carl Larson has this tidbit or not, because he did his, I don't remember him stating anything like that when he gave his presentation. So we're going to have to get this to him, and maybe he'd like to buy a book for $150. Oh, in chapter 1. Have you heard of men who, if they hope to view heaven at all, wish to do so from their automobiles? Well, husband is one of these. He acquired some years ago the first automobile in North Dakota, one of those comical effects that had the steering wheel in the back seat. This obliged women, proud as puck, with their large hats, in the front seat to lean out to right or left at times to give the driver a clear view of the road. Can you imagine the guy in the back seat yelling, lean left, lean right? And then I just threw this in because I thought this was extremely interesting. The North Dakota woman, she died at 103 years old, and her husband 8 years previously had died at 105. And they were thought to be the oldest couple living to be over 100 in the United States. They're buried at St. Mary's Cemetery. And that is 1917.